Okay. So, I start once again. Dear colleagues and friends of the Intercultural and Japanese Philosophy, on behalf of the Vienna Society for Intercultural Philosophy and Institute of Arts and Science, we would like to warmly welcome you to our today's conversation. Graham Parks and I are currently on the premises of the Institute, a long-standing supporter of the Vienna Society for Intercultural Philosophy. The Institute is located just one building away from Sigmund Freud's former home and workplace, and which is now a Freud Museum. The Society and the Institute both hold lectures and talks for academic and general audiences with the purpose of sharing our ideas with the broader public. And we are assisted in this endeavor by colleagues from all over the world. I would like to take this opportunity and to express my sincere thanks to our speakers today and to the many colleagues who have registered to join us from countries like Japan, Mexico, and Canada, as well from all over Europe. We will be recording the conversation, so please bear this in mind and let us know if you don't wish to be recorded. We also kindly ask the audience to switch off the micros and the cameras. For today's event on information and communication technologies from a Japanese perspective, we have invited the editors of the renowned volume Japanese Philosophy, a Sourcebook, James Heisig, Tom Kasulis, and John Maraldo. These names will be familiar to anyone involved in Japanese philosophy, and we are delighted to welcome these eminent scholars to our conversation today. Thank you so much for coming. James Heisig is an American philosopher who specializes in the field of philosophy of religion and is now professor emeritus at Nanzan University in Japan. He takes a somewhat different perspective on today's topic. Instead of looking at information technology as a problem for philosophers to think about, he looks as it is a problem for philosophy itself. As the discovery of coincidences, comparisons, and possibilities for critical dialogue with Japanese philosophy continues to gather steam in Western academia, the emergence of artificial intelligence may draw the two sides closer to the struggle to find philosophy a place in the contemporary world. Thomas Kasulis is a philosopher who has held many positions on Ohio State University and is now professor emeritus there. He explores the relationships between culture and philosophy throughout history. Using Japan and the West in his primary comparative focus, Kasulis hopes to assist not only in deepening philosophy's self-understanding, but also in envisioning an appropriate mission for philosophies in today's global context. John Maraldo, another philosopher from the United States, is professor emeritus at the University of North Florida. He has been learning how to do philosophy from Japanese perspectives for more than 50 years. Graham Parks, originally from Scotland and now a professional research fellow here at the University of Vienna, will be introducing the conversation and moderating then the discussion. He began studying Japanese philosophy several years later than John Maraldo, and is hoping that today's conversation will help him in his efforts to catch up. We would like to welcome you all and are very much looking forward to the conversation. And thank you very much for your numerous registrations. So, Graham, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, what you see here is the source book. Well, no, you see a two-dimensional image of the source book. This is the real thing, and the difference between the two-dimensional image and the real thing is going to be important later on. I always carry this with me to such events just in case I need to look anything up. So I'd like to begin by going back some 2,500 years to prepare you for what will, after all, be an old school event, to a Chinese text that had a lasting influence on Japanese philosophy, the Taoist classic Zhuangzi. In the 12th chapter, there's a wonderful story about the consequences of unreflective dependence on technology. A young disciple of Confucius comes across an old man who's laboriously fetching water in a pitcher from a well in order to irrigate his vegetable garden. He explains to the old man that there's a device called a well sweep, or it's like a shadoof, that would make his work much easier, and asks whether he'd like to try it out. The old man replies testily that he knows about such gadgets, but would be ashamed to use one. His teacher apparently warned him against frequent use of contraption because it would give him a mechanical heart and mind, and that would transform his ways of feeling and thinking. With a mechanical heart in your breast, you lose simplicity, and the spirit and life in you becomes unsettled, disconnecting you from the course, the way things are going. The concern with instrumental thinking from the perspective of utility, it anticipates a key theme in Zen Buddhism. Several stories in the Zhuangzi show how our tendency to look at the world in terms of what's in it for us restricts and impoverishes our experience and blinds us to the usefulness of uselessness. Much later, Zen Master Dogen shows how this way of looking at things diverts our attention from where we actually are, here, now, to some future purpose elsewhere. It also encourages a tendency to regard the means we employ to fulfill that purpose as a burdensome chore rather than an occasion for Zen practice. Another theme in Zhuangzi that's relevant to our topic is a concern with opposites. Zhuangzi highlights the human tendency to project opposite values onto the flux of experience so that we can handle it more easily, whereas in reality, there are no opposites, but just continuums, which are potentially too burdensome to pay attention to. Much easier to suppose that there's just black and white, so that we don't have to bother with all the shifting shades of gray in between. Now, no one has linked such thinking in opposites to overuse of digital technology as clearly as the novelist J.M. Coetzee. The protagonist of his novel Youth works as a mainframe computer programmer and has a revelation after studying the history of logic. I quote, "There are many alternative logics, he is convinced, just each as good as the logic of either or. The threat of the toy by which he earns his living, which is the mainframe computer, is that it will burn either or paths in the brains of its users and thus lock them irreversibly into its binary logic." Wow. Nowadays, the binary burn has spread like wildfire, with almost everything mediated through digital code. 0 or 1, off or on, swipe left or right, black or white, no or yes. You're either with us or against us, no middle ground or middle way, no sense of a flowing continuum. If societies today are polarized as never before, one factor could well be our unprecedented immersion in digital media. Now, the warning from Zhuangzi was interestingly taken up by Werner Heisenberg in his book from 1955, The Physicist's Conception of Nature. In discussing the role of modern technology, Heisenberg advocates caution. He writes, "The far-reaching changes in our environment and in our way of life, wrought by this technical age, have changed dangerously our ways of thinking." And to drive the point home, he points out that, quote, 2,500 years ago, the Chinese sage Zhuangzi spoke of the dangers of the machine when he said, and then he quotes the story of the well sweep I just recounted and adds, "This ancient tale contains a great deal of wisdom." Several years later, motivated by a similar concern about the effects of technology on our thinking, Marshall McLuhan, in his book Understanding Media, quotes with approval Heisenberg's quotation from Zhuangzi. McLuhan goes on to show that one effect of immersion in new media is a kind of numbing of the nervous system, that these media tend to make the user comfortably numb. His argument is too complex to rehearse here, but trust me, it works. He writes, the numbing or narcotic effect of new technology lulls attention, while the new form slams the gates of judgment and perception. No surprise then that that the effect of using these media can be addictive. He writes, subliminal and docile acceptance of media impact has made them prisons without walls for their human users. And that was in 1964, with only radio and television as the risky media. But the designers of apps have from the beginning taken advantage of this narcotic effect for the purpose of hooking the user, making their products ever more addictive. This narcotizing potential, which McLuhan gets to through the myth of Narcissus, whose name is related to the Greek narke, meaning numb, adds another dimension to the narcissism of the world of social media. 3 years after McLuhan, Guy Debord showed how the narcotic or soporific effect of media are at the basis of the modern spectacle. The spectacle puts us to sleep, he writes, by changing the real world into simple images, which then become effective motivators of hypnotic behavior. In short and wonderfully put, everything that used to be lived directly has been shifted into a representation. When we're asleep, we're on our own, psychologically speaking, and Debord shows how the spectacle encourages separation. Isolation is at the basis of the technologies employed by the spectacular system, and the technical process isolate in return. From the Japanese perspective, Western societies already had more than enough individualism to go around, but amped up by the spectacle, today's individualism stands in even starker contrast to the communitarian institutions and ways of thinking in Japan. Tom will be taking up this theme in just a few minutes. Concerning what we nowadays call digital immersion, Debord writes that our awareness, as shaped by the spectacle, becomes imprisoned in a flattened universe, bounded by the screen of the spectacle, behind which our own life has been deported. Now, Debord was thinking of film and television screens, but how much more true of the screen of the smartphone, which connects on the basis of having previously isolated. How much of their lives do young people nowadays spend gazing at representations on their screens? Let me finish with a remarkable perspective on representations from Nishitani Keiji's masterpiece, Religion and Nothingness, published in Japanese 6 years before Debord's book. One of the book's most provocative ideas is that Western philosophies have, for the most part, remained on the surface of the human experience. For Nishitani, there are actually 3 fields involved and that we live on. The field of consciousness, beneath that and broader, the field of nihility, and beneath that and still broader, the field of shunyata, or emptiness. On the field of consciousness in everyday life, Nishitani writes, we relate to things by means of concepts and representations. But in the field of consciousness, it's not really possible to get in touch with things as they are, to face them in their own mode of being and on their own home ground. But if we drop or are dropped down to the field of nihility, we still can't get in touch with things because we're in the abyss where nothing means anything. A field of infinite dispersion, as Nishitani puts it, where everything is cut off from everything else. Yet, if we hang in there, we may be fortunate enough to land on the deeper field of emptiness, where everything is reconnected and interacting, and we can get in touch with things on their home ground. The main point is this. If living among concepts and representations on the field of consciousness is superficial, imagine how shallow life becomes when you let everything that used to be lived directly get shifted into representations of representations, as on the screens through which so many people are nowadays living their lives. Okay, so now we open up the discussion for 10 minutes or so. So, Tom, Jim, John, wonderful to see you, three dear friends. And let's begin our conversation. Over to you, gentlemen.
I was curious
Was
about your
curious.
use of Nishitani at the end. I think it's very interesting and something that never occurred to me. This movement from consciousness to isolation to nihility, where there's we fall into the continuum where we lose all connections, and then emptiness where we're reconnected. But on that pattern, would you think of social media then as to say the artificial reconnection of the things that have been disconnected through nihilistic thought or habits of consumption or whatever, that the social medium is an artificial way of reconnecting and that blocks the way to emptiness? Or how do you understand social media there?
Yes, right. That's a difficult one because on the levels, it would seem to be sort of floating free of the field of consciousness because it's not only on the field of consciousness before ICT, at least we were used to dealing with representations. But now that we're representations that so-called direct living of life has been shifted into another level of representations, namely two-dimensional on a screen, it seems to me either that we'd be floating free, sort of above the field of consciousness, or that we'd be almost down to getting down to the nihility level, because it seems as if the connections the quality of the connections that we get through social media are also, I think John's going to talk about this shortly, are also um, uh, disconnect us. I mean, that they're not genuine connections. So yes, I'm not quite sure where one would exactly put it on Nishtani's schema there.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there's anything in Nishitani's I thou that's relevant to Jim's question.
Mm,
Uh,
mm.
uh, the three of you know Nishitani better than I do. I'm wondering if you could see if there's a connection there. The way he talks about that, is that somehow transformed, and in what way by the media?
I mean, there is a sense when he talks about the I thou that even though we're related, we're talking to each other, there's still this abyss of
Yeah, yeah,
difference between us, right? And
right,
that would be
right.
the nihility
That's
lurking
right,
beneath the
right.
field of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well,
yeah,
it would seem to me that many people would use social media in order to make I-thou connections, personal connections with somebody else. And what's the missing factor for me here is that all too often the thou, the other, is someone who is dislocated from where
Mhm.
one is in one's own environment. That's something that
That's
uh,
right.
I hope to talk about later. So, of course, this is not an explicit theme in Nishitani, but I think in the back of at the back of a lot of the things he wants to express. So, I was wondering, on the other hand, whether many people would regard something like AI, artificial intelligence in particular, as a kind of alternative to a lot of the binaries, the oppositions that you were talking about, Graham. Um, in the sense that, for example, to a certain extent here, we are involving ourselves in a kind of east-west
Mm.
opposition, maybe trying to find common ground there, but perhaps all too easily slipping into this oppositional or contrastive kind of thinking that some people might say, well, AI is something that overcomes this in many different ways because there's nothing Western or Eastern in essence about artificial intelligence. It is global. It's developed globally. It's been created globally. It's fed globally, and and even in its, I think, latest technologies, it may not even be predicated on binary logics of either either or. I'm thinking in particular of the attempt to produce quantum computers,
Right.
which don't work on either or logic, supposedly. I don't understand this very well, but I read that quantum computers somehow involve what they call a superposition of two states, either or, and that they result in something else. What they result in is more, we're told, probabilistic, but it's still a kind of rule. It's still seeking to settle something. It's not clear to me whether it is going to result in anything like your continuum or your common ground that you invoke, Graham. So it's part of the ambiguity in our ambivalence towards AI and towards these technologies. But in any case, AI itself would seem to be something that overcomes a lot of these splits, these binaries that we're expressing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we are, after all, I think there's an AI assisting us right now in our talking together. So although we're going to be complaining a bit, I suppose, yes, we're also grateful for it bringing us together. And I hope you're right, John. I hope that with the move, with the way AI is heading, that it will get a bit more humanly intelligent. Because at the moment, it seems to me that it's developing, and it's exacerbating certain forms of thinking, and those are, in general, I think, either or and logical and rational thinking. Whereas I think Jim's going to talk about this. There's the Boethius's distinction between ratio and intellectus, that what would be nice would be a more human intelligence, and one that obviously has to do with the body, not just the mind. I mean, I think that at the moment, so much of ICT is dominated by people who are Cartesian dualists. They spend so much time sitting in front of the computer that they think they may not have a body after all, and that they're just a mind. But I'm wary of the clock, and so I'm thinking that we should go on to Tom, and you will both have discussed these issues by the
Graham,
time.
if I could, before you go on, I want to ask something. At the beginning, you talked about the continuum as closer to the nature of reality, and that logics, especially binary logics, break it up. And in the end, we return to the continuum as an infinite dispersion where everything is disconnected from everything else. Now, everything being disconnected or everything being connected, ultimately, I think, kind of come to the same thing in terms of experience. But Nishida, when he talked about going back to the level before subject-object dichotomy, he saw this as a positive thing, returning to the continuum. And the way you read Nishitani, it seems to sound like a negative thing.
Yes, I suppose I'm wondering whether the field of nihility, whether that intermediate step, I'm not sure that seems much more of a discontinuum to me. You know, if everything is dispersed and flying apart, nothing means anything. Where I mean, that is a perspective on reality. I mean, that is telling us something about reality, but thank heavens there seems to be a deeper continuum, or a way of getting more into the continuum where we do feel fully connected.
Okay, well, I leave it there. Yeah.
Too difficult for me, Jim. I think we'll have to come back to that. So, Tom, yes, we're ready for you.
Okay. The matrix of ICT implicates itself in almost every corner of societies today. The acquisition of knowledge, interpersonal communication, education, and various modes of creative expression, which, by the way, I hope we don't lose sight of the creative possibilities of CIT. Yet, as it becomes ever more ubiquitous in our daily lives, it raises serious issues about our self-understanding of human beings. ICT is an issue for philosophical anthropology. Like any other field of philosophy, philosophical anthropology reflects the cultural assumptions of its time and place. In the West, the Enlightenment and modern philosophy have ushered in a heightened sense of free will and choice, personal autonomy, and the integrity of the human subject as an individual. Because ICT erodes the stability of these categories in my self-understanding, despite its remarkable utility, it may also seem existentially threatening. My conscious keystroke or mouse click can be overridden by the unrequested hyperlinks and an endless stream of advertising. Even personal identities assume the mask of avatars and usernames. The machine's responses to those personas becomes the focus of complex algorithms that both identify and shape my counter responses. Increasingly, the mask leaves its imprint on the face behind it. With such deterioration of free choice, personal autonomy, and the integrity of personal identity, has ICT transformed me into little more than a computer script, a complex matrix of interconnected electronic I/O transactions. The question gnaws at my humanistic sense of self. However global these insecurities may be, notice that I have posed them within the parameters of modern Western philosophical anthropology. What happens if I shift the context to an understanding informed by East Asian, particularly Japanese parameters? Japan's understanding of human beings is the intertwining of three heritages. From Buddhism, Japan engages a worldview that understands reality to be a complex, interdependent set of processes or events. There are no elemental or fundamental entities that are distinctive, individual, or substantial, not even the I or ego. As the 13th century Zen master Dogen explained, we are just figures in that world extending in all directions. I know it is so because my body-mind appears along with the whole world, and I know that it is not an I separate from the inventory of the world. My body is already not an isolated I. Life is carried along in the passage of time, hard to encapsulate for even a moment. A second strand comprising the Japanese sense of human being derives from Confucianism. Like Buddhism, Confucianism views human beings as interdependent rather than strictly independent. But Confucians stress social rather than ontological interdependence. 5 interpersonal binaries constitute relations defining who I am as a human being: Lord, subject, parent, child, husband, wife, senior, junior, and friend, friend. In his influential book Ethics, the modern Japanese philosopher Watsuji Tetsuo argued that to be human is to live in the midst, Aidagata, between the individual and the social. In analyzing the Japanese word for human being, ningen, he writes, ningen means in the world itself, yet it also means as well the individual person who is in the world. Therefore, if human being is not simply the individual person, it is also not simply society. Within human being, these two are unified dialectically. The third strand goes back to the indigenous animistic worldview that preceded the influx of complex philosophies from China or Korea. In broad terms, we can consider this a Shinto influence, later reinforced somewhat by mainland Taoism. Here we find no bifurcation between humans and nature, nor is there a dualism of body and mind. In the poetry collection of the medieval philosopher-poet Saigyo, we find, the so-called detached observer of blossoms finds himself over time intimate with them. So when the blossoms separate from the branch, it is he who falls deeply into grief. This leads me to 2 observations in relation to ICT. First, in the traditional Japanese philosophical context, the Western anxiety stemming from ICT's assault on free choice, personal autonomy, and the integrity of the individual would have little provenance. What the West most fears losing to ICT, Japan never stressed in the first place. You cannot be anxious about losing what you never had. That observation suggests the particulars of Western anxiety about ICT is just that, a modern Western cultural phenomenon. Secondly, over the centuries, Japan has developed a rich and coherent philosophical anthropology not revolving around those parameters of the West. This leads to two questions with respect to the threat of ICT. First, might the impact of ICT force the Western cultural understanding of self to evolve more toward the Japanese position of the insubstantial self? If so, the West might come to accept ICT without perceiving it as so much a threat to our basic humanity. Second, does the Japanese self-understanding of humanity really inoculate it against ICT anxiety? It does not. But the Japanese anxiety about ICT arises from its own cultural tradition of humanism. Let us consider how. The addictive nature of ICT, executed via the algorithms of identification and repetitive reinforcement, comes as no surprise to Japanese Buddhist psychology. The Japanese Buddhist contemplative tradition aims to overcome the delusions created by patterns of thinking and behavior inculcated by ignorance, repulsion, and attraction. The potential manipulative power of ICT derives from the same three delusion-generating sources. Ignorance takes the form of promulgating false information not justified by empirical evidence. Repulsion takes the form of alienating us from some other, forming a pattern of suspicion and hatred rather than inclusiveness or compassion. As for attraction, it draws on the nature of human neurology. We are a hypersensitive stimulus response system, especially attracted to flashing lights, fast movements, and abrupt sounds. Using its reiterative algorithms, ICT has created an almost inescapable immersive environment that inhibits quiet moments of reflection. We need that reflection, the Buddhists insist, to appreciate the larger environment around us for what it is. From the Confucian perspective, the danger lies in ICT's dissociation from the 5 cardinal social dyads. It places face-to-face interaction with cyber-mediated relationships. Many Japanese criticize their young people who fixate on a single interest, such as anime or manga, but no longer join clubs or social groups about those things. Instead, the so-called otaku limit their interpersonal interactions to like-minded fanatics via the internet, concealed behind the veil of the computer avatar and artificial username. How ironic. The classical Japanese language uses the same signograph to mean either to meet or to know. Yet through computers we pretend to know others without ever really meeting them. For the Confucian, a friend-friend relation is more than a computer click of a cent. Lastly, the culture of ICT undermines the ancient stress on the inseparability of humanity and nature, as well as of body and mind. ICT creates its own environment, one disconnected from living concretely as part of the natural world. ICT draws the attention away from the full-bodied sensorium of the physical world into a denatured, abstracted, virtual reality. In summary, let's not universalize ICT's threats to human identity. ICT does indeed assault our senses of who we are, but our identities are always couched in cultural terms. As Wasserji once noted, the presumption that human nature is the same in all cultures is an idea found only in the West. I might add that a similar presupposition drives ICT and AI wherever they are found, as John just mentioned. So given all this, what to do? A Japanese-style approach might be to contest ICT even while accepting its inestimable utility. The goal would be to reserve our embodied interpersonal relations in connection to the materiality of nature. For example, what if, after 30 or 45 minutes of use, the internet browsers on my iPhone went blank until I spent at least 5 minutes talking to someone on that phone via FaceTime? A non-avataric someone with a human face with its furrowed eyebrows or twinkling eyes and a voice full of affect. Or what if the screen went blank for 2 minutes and encouraged us to be aware of all the sights, sounds, tastes, and smells enveloping us, not just what had been emanating from the smartphone or computer? We are always conditioned, though not determined, by our milieu. ICT is part of the environment, but only part. We need to undermine its design to dominate the place in which we define ourselves so that we can use ICT to enhance our relation with others and our body-mind engagement with the natural world. In the terminology of the Kyoto School of Philosophers, we must define the proper logical place for ICT to function in our lives, which is very much what Graham was trying to do in his introduction. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Yeah, I say something. You make wonderful points about the Confucian and Buddhist traditions, and when you got to the FaceTime example, you're forced to actually look at the face and talk to it. I thought, yes, but we can't take it further than that, because if you think of the cardinal social dyads, those Confucian relationships are all based on two bodies in the same space, I believe. Sometimes they have messengers. But I mean, I think that face-to-face, two bodies in the same room is so important, because so much of what, especially if you're the servant listening to the master, you've got to be listening to what he doesn't say. And then I think in Japan, all the time, you have to be listening to what is left unsaid. And you get that in part through looking at the person's face, or looking at their gestures or whatever. And that's what it seems to me is missing, this whole somatic dimension to a human relationship.
I agree with your point, but you said two different things that don't quite jibe. I think maybe I didn't make clear enough. I wanted to contrast the passive watching of the iPhone and going through YouTube clicks or whatever versus talking to somebody on FaceTime where you actually see the other person interact with you. That is, you do see exactly as I saw you just nod, your eyebrows raised, right? Now that is something different than my sitting there watching a YouTube presentation of you, because in this case, those reactions are part of our interpersonal shared space. I think we can, of course, Confucius did not imagine relations at a distance, right? So we can't say what Confucius would say about that. But it is, I think a key point is that social media changes our interaction, like you and I are having right now, into performance for an audience. I mean, one of the things about social media is that there may be thousands, tens of thousands, for the influencers, millions of people watching me. I am no longer I'm no longer in a Confucian relationship at all. I'm on a stage performing for others, and I'm being evaluated by others instead of interacting with others. So rather than somebody frowning, am I reacting to the frown? There are millions of people who are reacting in all kinds of different ways, and myself becomes just a performance, no longer an I-thou relation, at least in Buber sense, and probably also Nishitani sense.
It reminds me just very briefly of the difference between publishing a book and talking it to somebody.
Yes,
because once it's published, you never know how they're going to react to it.
That's right.
Tom, you said something at the end that that touches on this this point, and it's a point that's bound to come up every time you talk about social media. You said, "I urge us not to universalize ITC's threat to our humanistic identity." Now, there's two ways of understanding that sentence. One is that the threat is not uniform, but it's culturally specific. And with that, I would agree perfectly, that the threat is experienced differently by different cultures, and even different age groups. But the other one, that the threat is not universal, that there are aspects of it that are a universal threat. That's what I wonder about.
Okay.
So the philosophical question comes down to this. You spoke of betweenness, Watsuji's idea of the human being as being in the midst of other human beings. Okay? Now, the betweenness for Watsuji, I guess, is morally neutral. It can lead to solidarity and love. It can lead to conflict and isolation. Now, insofar as social media is a kind of betweenness, that is to say, that's how it's experienced, even as you were just describing, is this also morally neutral, or is there perhaps some aspect to it that is a genuine threat and therefore no longer morally neutral as a medium?
Okay, that excellent question. And this allows me to go back to something John said. I am not denying that on the abstract level, the threat is universal, and we can talk about that. But the particularities of the anxiety is always culturally colored, let's say, or as Miki Kyoshi said, has a coloration or hue that of the culture. So yes, there is something disturbing about the ICT in general because of the way it forces the kind of binaries and so forth that Graham was talking about. But also, though, we have to say, does it have to be so? And John's mention of quantum computing, I think, is really rather important here, which can get out of that binary box. And so the issue then, I think, is, and it's a difficult one, is it moral to persuade other people through the medium? And I think we all have to say, well, it depends upon who's doing the persuading and what the intention is. In other words, it is a traditional moral problem that has to be evaluated in that. An abstract thing called ICT is not a moral agent. The person using, devising, interacting with ICT introduces agency. Just as language is not an agent, but what the person says can be positive or negative. In fact, one might claim you cannot speak without being moral, either positively or negatively. And in a way, I think ICT is in the same situation. It is forcing a kind of morality. And depending upon who's using it and how, because I don't want to underestimate the importance of the creative aspects of ICT, which are doing somewhat remarkable things that scares the entire movie industry, writers and actors and so forth out of their minds, because computer generation of things can actually replace their jobs. But taking it out of that context, the idea that I could create a scene that is as rich a computer generated graphic as I would have to pay someone else to do, or I wouldn't bother even doing because it's too complicated, allows me the possibility of new creativity. And I think Graham Parks's work is an extraordinarily pioneering in this. His Dancing Philosopher website and all of that. He's bringing a media that, in fact, you notice that is him dancing with us in his website. Is that really making an I-it relation? Or is it, in fact, an invitation to engage in a way that had not been possible before these breakthroughs in technology?
I think we'd better go on to Jim at this point because I'm looking at the clock again.
Actually, my comments are a direct continuation of the question of Tom's comments left in my mind. Namely, it's not just the content of social media, and I'm not talking about ICT in general, but social media. It's not just the content that's up for moral discussion, but the medium itself. And I think the morality of the medium itself is something independent of the people who are actually communicating, just as the nature of betweenness is distinct from the individuals who are connected to one another. In any case, let me begin with my prepared remarks. We are still a long way from taking seriously the crisis in modern philosophy that Husserl alerted us to, namely, its distance from the Lebenswelt of ordinary people. Japan's experience of this crisis was rather different from our own. It had imported Western philosophy as part of a package that included the social order and the mindset of the Industrial Revolution. By studying philosophy, its leaders hoped to better understand the intellectual foundations of modern society in the West. But the more they understood, the greater their resistance to the wholesale colonization of their own traditions by alien modes of thought. For some, this hardened quickly into an ultranationalism. But the more balanced of Japan's thinkers turned their attention to a critique of modernity. It was in this maelstrom of ideas that modern Japanese philosophy struggled to forge an identity at once faithful to its received wisdom and suspicious of the excesses in what they had imported. So on the one hand, we have thinkers like Nishitani Keiji and Ueda Shizuteru, insisting on the importance of what Zen called the everyday mind, or like Nakamura Yujiro, who called for a restoration of the categories of common sense and practical wisdom. On another front, we have Sakabe Megumi and Yuasa Yasuo pleading with academic philosophy to pay more attention to the role of the body and aesthetic practice. On the other hand, we have thinkers like Tosaka Jun, Hiromatsu Wataru, Miki Kiyoshi, and Karatani Koji, who position themselves against the professionalization of philosophy to the neglect of the social and political realm. Since the 1980s, their combined assault on detached, disinterested, and dispirited abstraction has attracted the attention of students of philosophy from around the world. And rather than try to summarize their contributions to the general history of philosophy, I'd like to focus on the topic that brings us here today, and in particular, on the challenge of artificial intelligence, which seems to me a microcosm of the crisis that philosophy faces in recovering its role in the public sphere and in everyday life of ordinary people. AI has already sounded the death knell for the monopoly of the philosophical lecture hall, where teachers face learners as donors to recipients. The direct and critical engagement with ideas that philosophy relies on is sabotaged when both already have a whole library of philosophical texts and arguments, positions and counterpositions at their fingertips. No attempt to outlaw the use of AI, even on a limited scale, is likely to survive the appeal of such a resource. The solution will have to be sought elsewhere. Perhaps the only realistic reform of society available to individuals overwhelmed by AI is something like the one-straw revolution of the Zen farmer and philosopher Fukuoka Masanobu. For him, this meant renouncing green revolution technology and learning to feed ourselves by leaving nature alone as far as possible. His idea of setting up alternatives for specific tasks by disestablishing them from any kind of corporate control and making them a better fit for autonomous control on a smaller, if more fragile scale, may be applied to the practice of philosophy as well. But for the professional academic, trained to teach philosophy and contribute to its advance, a break with the established curriculum and its mechanisms of peer evaluation may seem true greater risk to job security and career advancement. The mere hope of contributing to the good and convivial life seems rather watery gruel compared to the hearty buffet of options available within the university system. Nevertheless, despite the pressures to postpone that hope or confine it to academic discussions like this, the vocation is available for those who have the courage to follow it. For the philosopher, the task at hand is to rescue intelligence from its captivity to information algorithms. Boethius's distinction between ratio and intellectus can help us here. Ratio, he said, is the discursive, syllogistic mental labor of moving sequentially from premise to conclusion. Its idea of truth is a function of argument and inference operating at the periphery of reality. Intellectus, in contrast, is the simpler achievement of insight that comes to rest in the still point at the center of the circle, the moment of eternity and time, he calls it. So rather than scan the landscape rationally piece by piece, it views it as a constellation of the whole of its parts, both the outer landscape of the world, as reconstructed in mind, and the inner landscape of our feelings toward the world. The pursuit of the good life of the ordinary mind requires just such a restoration of the fullness of intellectus. The intelligence of AI is achieved through the coordination and manipulation of data extracted from scientific measurement, rational concepts, and factual history. In this sense, it is better described as a kind of artificial insemination. Lacking the capacity to achieve the still point of intellectus, it's designed to reproduce itself through the constant and chaotic turbulence of more data and more analysis. The errors of hallucination, still very visible in AI's remittance of data, are not corrigible through more data or more complex methods of resolving problems and rationalizing the chaos. At a more basic level, they are symptomatic of the absence of the still point of reasoning that William James referred to as the sentiment of rationality. Any philosophical truth disassociated with intellectus by design is as far from the pursuit of the good life of the ordinary mind as philosophy can get. The greater promise, but also the greater peril of AI, is its appearance of a total democracy divorced from external governments and censorship. The widespread assumption that AI is simply a tool whose utility and limits depend on the person who wields it is an empty shell of an idea. AI is not simply a new development of software that one can access through a personal computer or a digital device. It's an institution, in the sense that Durkheim and Foucault use the term. Namely, it's already begun to redefine the contours of what it means to know. It is, we might say, a mental institution without walls. What we do not take seriously enough is the institutional dependency of these same corporations on a mass superstition that they feed and feed off of at the same time. To think of AI as a mere tool with revolutionary potential for supplementing the acquisition and application of knowledge is no less a conceit than the belief that the structural changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution would one day democratize the consumption of goods and services by optimizing access to everything from food and clothing to literacy and health. The control of AI is no more firmly in the hands of those who monetize it and legalize its use than the worldview that rooted the Industrial Revolution and the modern imagination was. At the surface, it includes a wealth of data for self-evaluation and critique. Beneath the surface, its coding is immune to change as long as it's embedded in the imagination as a comprehensive tool for managing the social order down to its smallest units. Ironically, is the way in which AI has begun to threaten the fundamental structures by which the history of philosophical thought is transmitted, and the credibility of the expertise that keeps academic philosophy academic, oblige the philosopher committed to the pursuit of the good life to seek alternative ways to communicate and restore a respect for philosophical thinking outside the control of peer review. Tanabe Hajime argued that philosophy can only be reborn through the collapse of its current state, and this collapse can only take place by loosening fixed but tacit habits of thought that hobble the freedom of thinking, that is, through metanoia. Nishitani Keiji made much the same point by citing the koan of the water buffalo, whose head, horn, and legs pass through a window while its tail end gets stuck. The koan presents a situation, he writes, where orthodox reasoning fails, revealing an irrational residue that logic cannot fully explain, a tail, an integral part of the thing itself that protrudes through the mesh of law and the lattice of reason. We've come to a point, according to Nishitani, where the intellectual life needs to stretch beyond the bounds of its internal logic. And to do this, it needs to recover itself in the marketplace. The image of philosophy climbing into the academy with its tail hanging out the window seems just right. The paralysis will not be relieved by widening the window or pushing harder on it from behind. The unmasking of AI as a kind of Ouroboros slowly but inexorably choking on its own tail is one best handled in the open space where the ordinary mind can understand what it is that philosophy has to contribute to the good life. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So, John,
I'm a, I think, I don't know how it is that I agree with you, but I have problems with what you said. Um, uh, the saying AI is not a tool, let me be a devil's advocate and make it quick.
Okay.
Um, to say that AI is a tool is an interesting claim, is not a tool, is an interesting claim. Is language a tool?
Um, yes, yes, of
Okay.
course.
So then how is AI more of a threat than language?
No, language is a tool, but it's not only a tool. AI is a tool, but it's also an institution, a mode of thought.
Well,
So,
isn't language often an institution?
well,
Isn't language
especially when you get to alphabets, which then control the way language functions,
right?
the way it works. So
Right.
written language and spoken language are different
Sure.
phenomena.
Okay.
They're both tools. We use them as if they were the same kind of tool, but in fact, there's a different mindset behind them. That's
That's right.
what I'm
So
interested
is
in.
AI, see, Mike, again, devil's advocate, why isn't AI now a third tool in the
Well,
same kind of way?
in the same sense that the factory is not simply a tool of manufacturing, right? It's a tool of recreating social order, that is to
Yep.
say, of removing the product from the creation of an individual and putting it on a conveyor belt, which then passes over into hospitalization, where we have specializations, and passing it over into school, where we go from first grade to second grade to third grade, certification, that whole thing. It's also a frame of mind. But because it's a tool, we forget that it's a frame of mind. We forget that the tool controls us as soon as we have it in our hand. That's my point. Not that it isn't a tool, but it isn't just a tool.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
more. It's an institution.
It has become an institution. Is it intrinsic to AI that it has to be an institution in that way? I don't know. That is your concern,
Uh-huh.
your
Yeah.
assumption. I'm not sure you've shown that.
No, I haven't, but I would say yes. I think I've used it enough to realize that it's as
Well, you're
different.
doing a very primitive form of it.
Yes, of course.
I mean,
I
as if
use it for
you're
computer
dealing with the
coding.
caveman going, ugh, for language, and from that you're speculating on what language is capable of or
Yes,
not capable
yes,
of.
yes.
But I just want to throw out there as a devil's advocate to think
Hmm.
about, does AI have to be do? Can it be institutionalized in a different way? Can, just as language is institutionalized by various institutions,
I
And
think
I
like
that's
propaganda.
I
So
think that's the
I'll leave
problem.
this.
I,
Yeah.
I I don't think so. And I think that's the real danger, exactly that point, because those who commercialize it and control it and legalize it, and the governments that want to manage it, the school corporations that want to adjust their systems to it, I don't think they realize what it's done. I mean, people directing PhD thesis must already see this. It's not just a tool like books in a library. It's really
But people
revol
control what books are in the
revolting
library
from the
now.
bottom.
That's the control of
Yes.
language.
Yeah.
Okay.
well, coming
I don't want,
coming back to something that you said earlier, Tom, uh, language is language is not an agent. I
right.
believe you said in certain senses. So a lot of people are worried, especially in this country, about AI as emerging as a kind of super intelligence that acts on its own. That is, in other words, an agent.
Mhm.
Mm.
And I don't know the sense in which that's going to happen. Um, I have so much ambivalence about this ambiguous phenomenon called AI. Jim, you describe it as emerging as an institution in itself, which is going to reframe the way that we live in the world and the way
Yeah.
we categorize things. But one of my questions is AI really like a unitary phenomenon?
Mm.
Is it really like one entity or like one
Mm.
something like one emerging brain, one kind of embodiment,
Mm.
or is it by its very nature very distributed, dispersed, scattered, not a unified thing at all? And maybe that's one of the problems about it, that it's maybe that's what can make it even more pernicious, because it's not one particular set or flow of the ratiocinations that you described. It's not one thing that has a particular viewpoint on things. It is.
Yes.
It's kind of a maze to us, and we don't know yet what's going to emerge under this name AI. So how do you see it in light of those?
I think you're absolutely right that it's not uniform at all, but that it will adjust itself according to different situations. The same way that the Industrial Revolution adjusted, that the hospitals and schools and transportation and so forth adjusted themselves to the idea of the Industrial Revolution, but they're all part of the same mindset, all promising the same democracy and accessibility of goods and services, but not doing it. Now, it's interesting. There already have been court cases where people have used AI and ended up fabricating information that the judge caught. AI is going to learn from that. It's not going to make the same mistake twice, at least not in the specific legal field that was being discussed. The New York Times recently published an article about a new book by a man named Stephen Rosenbaum called The Future of Truth. And it was an examination of AI and its dangers of reshaping reality and trust in the public discourse and so forth. The problem is the book was full of fabricated and misattributed quotes that came from AI. Huh? Well, AI is going to learn from that. And the next person who writes a book about it using AI is not going to make the same mistakes. So it's growing. It's not growing into a unified form. I don't think. I think that fear is a little bit naive, or at least a little bit early. Robots taking over the world as if they had one master. I think that's a little bit early, but it certainly is growing and changing. Yes.
I have to play time devil's advocate here, and John, give it to you because we want to leave time at the end for a discussion. So sorry to interrupt. Lots of questions to ask, but right. John, let's hear from you.
Okay, good. Yeah. So John Maraldo here to talk about ICTs from Japanese perspectives from Terre Haute, Indiana, in the States where I am, about 9 in the morning, and here I am somehow connected with you now on an internet that seemingly dislodges me from that location, at least until I get another tornado warning, as we've had here several times this past week. But except for times when bad weather threatens, it's so easy to get online and put myself into a different space thanks to these IC technologies. They're so prevalent, as Tom pointed out in the beginning. They're so obvious that most of us are oblivious of their preponderance. We usually don't even notice them. It's hard for me to talk about them in the plural, these technologies. Usually we notice this invisible net only when some problem cuts us off from it, or when some part of the web makes the news, like the news warning of the dangers of AI, which of course now drives all these technologies. I don't hear us saying that ICTs are entirely dangerous or undesirable, and our goal isn't to sit here and try to calculate their pluses and minuses and give a final score. I hear us trying to open up a broader perspective so we can begin to understand them in a comparative light, in a historical light. And when we say from Japanese perspectives, that doesn't mean that we think the insights we gather from East Asian traditions are entirely unique, as if those traditions were isolated and disconnected from other cultures. So far, you three have sketched the topic in broad strokes and in somewhat finer detail, especially focusing on AI, with a justified sense of urgency, I think. What I'd like to do in a few minutes is to focus in on 3 more particular issues, more selective, issues that people often find personally challenging. And the first issue has to do with attention. And to make my point, I want to quote from, not from a Japanese source, but from an interview in a newspaper with a United States senator who's now facing the end of his life. He comments, to quote him, "The super devices we have in our pockets, the largest tools any individual's ever had access to in all of human history, they allow our consciousness to leave the time and place where we actually live, the places where we break bread, the people who are living next door to us, the people you can physically touch and hug, the small platoons of real community." And then he goes on, "We don't yet know how to navigate the economic and cultural and familial disruptions that are coming from this technology." So what he says rings true enough, but then it's not simply that these relatively new technologies transport us to other places. You know, that happens when we read a novel or watch a movie too, or sometimes engross ourselves in philosophical thoughts. For the most part, we're aware of these shifts of attention, and they can expand attention. But seems to me when personal, privately owned super devices grab and hold one's attention for whatever reasons, for their ease of use or their psychological appeal or their power to attach someone to being elsewhere, then this being somewhere else easily floats us away from attention to our bodily being in an earthly place with other lives, other life forms, in a local environment that grounds every one of us. This all points me to two different forms of attention. Attention can be scattered and detached, dispersing. I'm searching for the right word here. It's not an absence of attention or simply a lulling of any attention. It's rather an attention to this object for a few seconds and then attention on that object, flitting about without our even noticing, all the while taking us elsewhere than where we bodily are. Or attention can be grounded, rooted in an awareness of actually being somewhere. So the challenge then is both to keep aware of the unseen conditions that enable ICTs and to keep in touch with the environment that's here right before our eyes. When we lift them off the screen, that is, and when we see the screen in the midst of a whole world around us. So these two forms of attention, call them scattered and rooted, scattered technology that our technologies seem to provoke and encourage, and rooted attention that can locate us and keep an environment in view. These are, perhaps we could call them practices that I think become apparent, for me at least, from Japanese perspectives. And if there's time later, I'll tell an anecdote that nicely illustrates the two forms of attention. So, but the second issue I'll mention has to do with kinds of connection, isolating and interlinking. So here we see how ICTs can change the ways we are with other people. Let me start again with something I recently heard from a local non-Japanese source. A middle school teacher I recently talked to said that children today rarely actually play together, play card games or board games or physical games together. Instead, with their individual smartphones and personal devices, they communicate with others who are not in their presence, not bodily with them. So our personal devices both connect us to others and cut us off from others. We hear a lot about young people's addiction to social media today. This is the narcotic effect that Graham mentioned. a form of dependence that seems to individualize and isolate. We heard earlier about the spectacle of representations that encourages separation and isolation, meaning that this mode of communication can remove a felt sense of interdependence with others. Now, if this addictive dependence is a big problem, then just to notice that can at least start to bring to light what's missing, a realization of our interdependence, our interlinking. For several Japanese philosophers, and not only they, being with others by respecting our interdependence is an exemplary practice. Forefronting being with others is not considered a temptation to be inauthentic and not truly oneself, two of the Western assumptions that Tom mentioned. So to focus a moment on the perspective of Nishitani Keiji, who draws, as we've seen, mostly from Zen ideas and practices, it looks like a big leap from the topic of ICTs, but I'll eventually make the connection. Nishitani's book, Religion and Nothingness, we've heard about, is a good source. It has a lot of interpretation of the basic Buddhist notion of interdependence, what in Japanese is called engi, independent arising or co-dependent arising. But Nishitani uses a rather unusual metaphor to describe interdependence among humans and other beings. In other words, the way of being with others. He speaks of the circulating reciprocity of master and servant. So I think there's three things to notice here. First, who is master and who is servant? One reading of Nishitani has it that each being is master of itself, yet servant to all others. Nishitani also writes that all things are master and servant to one another, and that all things are in a process of becoming master and servant to one another. A slight twist is to say that one is master of oneself by being servant to all others. In this way of being reciprocal, a kind of interplay, is a way that I and others are to be both master and servant. The next thing to notice is what that means. What does it mean to be master? What does it mean to be servant? To put it simply, I think Nishitani says that being master means to truly be oneself. Yes, that's right. Be autonomous and yet not self-centered. To speak of in English, servant, that's a translation of a Japanese word that as a verb means to be compliant with, shitagao. But I don't think it has the sense of submission in this case. And the third thing to notice is why one's relation with others must be of this sort. Nishitani argues that no thing can be itself except in its relation with all others. In other words, autonomy in effect is relational. What is more, he notes that ancient Greek philosophy also recognized a force. He says, a force by virtue of which all things are gathered together and brought into relationship with one another. And they called that force physis, nature. In short, one is oneself. All things are what they are by existing in a web of relationships. And this is not only an interhuman relationship, but one with all forms of being. It's a kind of a metaphysical observation about the way things are, the way they arise and exist. There's also an ethical side to that relationship. We can think of being a servant as serving others. And that also holds for Nishitani, but he expands it beyond the interhuman relationships to this force he calls nature, which allows us to co-determine how we act. That is, we can see through the illusion of being totally, willfully in control by being compliant. So here's the relevance, I think, of all this for information and communication technologies. Most, if not all, people want to connect to others. That's a big reason why ICTs are so pervasive, why we're so often sucked into our smartphones. And according to the information we hear, our phones and devices also disconnect and isolate us, and easily take us away from others right here with us, from what's right before our eyes, from the environmental conditions that make our lives possible and often problematic. So connections can be isolating, self-centering, or they can be interlinking, compliant to communal being, attuning to others wherever they find themselves. I find a little bit of Nishitani's sense of serving at work, for example, in courses I learned about from what's going on right now at my old University of North Florida, where philosophy courses now have a service component that requires students to personally reach out into the community and lend a hand in a way that really enlivens their learning. One thing to notice, though, is that for Nishitani, as well as for many, maybe the most East Asian philosophical traditions, is that technology is part of nature. This means that nature is not thought of as whatever is non-human, as whatever is not man-made, to use the catchword. And to borrow a phrase from Nishitani's teacher, Nishida Kitaro, technologies are extensions of the human enactment of the world, the ways that humans, and I would add other sentient beings too, are formed by a surrounding world that then remake the world. Technologies emerge under physical and environmental conditions. In our hands, they also change those conditions, but within natural constraints. Nishitani actually gives an interesting example of technology as natural and human at the same time. He says, we and the things we make are all bound by natural laws, like the law of gravitation, but we also learn to use, for example, gravity of the sun now to energize our spacecraft and reach the moon, as happened about a week ago again. But if technology is part of nature, then it too can be the part that pretends, that hallucinates that it's the whole thing, with nothing left over beyond its sway, beyond its control. And I think we are the hallucinators when we see AI as the savior or the destroyer of everything. The first thing to notice about the Confucian 5 relationships is each one of us participates in each of those relationships. So it's not as if I belong to one of the 5, I belong to all of the 5. It's usually thought that only one of those 5 is non-hierarchical, and that's the relationship between friend and friend. However, in Nishitani's view, what I hear him implying is that there's the relationship between master and servant is reciprocal. It is non-hierarchical. He doesn't use that, he doesn't come out and say that explicitly, but I think that that's pretty clear in the way that he talks about the circulating reciprocity, the egoteki nature of the relationship among all beings, not just in the guise of master and servant. So I understand that the talk of master and servant could lead one to think that he's somehow talking about how we have to subordinate ourselves and submit to others in a rather hierarchical fashion. And perhaps there's a residue of that sort of subordination in his model of servant and master, which, by the way, as far as I can tell, is not a model that for which he uses Buddhist sources, but rather a quotation from Martin Luther. But the way he talks about the reciprocity, I think, goes in the direction of erasing subordination, total subordination to a greater power. The power is in the relationship itself. It's not in the hands of the so-called master. One empowers oneself in Nishitani's view by serving others. And we don't serve nature as some sort of abstract force, but as the natural conditions of our life, for which we need to realize and recognize. In a way, I think that many technologies today are distracting us from. An example would be the way in which our worries about AI, typically, whether there's worry that it's going to become some super intelligence and somehow act on its own, or whether it's going to take away our jobs, or whether it's going to submit us to too much surveillance. All of those are a kind of distraction from a problem which I see more pressing, and that is the environmental conditions which make AI possible, and the the way that AI is consuming not only our attention and our worries and our minds, but it's consuming the environments that are necessary for life on Earth, in the form, for example, of massive data centers, for example. So I'll just leave it at that.
Tom, Jim, anything to say at this juncture?
I found it important that you tried to bring the question of AI into the question of science in general. And I think I was taken by John's idea of attention, the scattering of attention, and the need to find a way to recenter or to root yourself again. And science and AI share this, that they are also not scattered forms of attention, but very rooted and very centered, according to methods, according to laws, according to experimentation. They are not scattered forms of attention. But that's not what John was talking about, because the one thing AI and scientific method can't do is it can't meditate. It can't center the mind. It can't center the body. It's, as Graham said at the beginning, it's useful. Nishtani's idea of the centering of the mind and body, samadhi, is play, and useless play. Somebody says, here, give me a hand, or lend me an ear, or run your eye over this. And my body gets scattered during the day, and I have to find a way to bring myself back together again. That's been my life since I was young. But with the social media, my mind becomes scattered. It looks like it's focused on a screen and on a certain set of relationships, but in fact, it becomes scattered. I think it's really important as a philosophical text, not simply to talk about this phenomenon, but find ways to introduce centering. Meditation. Meditation is a scary word. It sounds quasi-religious, but a way of centering what's been scattered. This belongs to philosophy as much as the classroom and the textbook does, I think.
Sorry, that leads me to a question for John, because when you talk about when you talk about Nishitani's talking about technology as a part of nature, and Nishida is saying that it's just an extension of human enactment. I think I don't want I don't want us to lose. I want to go back to Zhuangzi and don't want us to lose the important, helpful distinctions we can make between what comes from the human, as he puts it, and what comes from Chen, what comes from the nature. Because if Zhuangzi and Nietzsche says the same thing, if they're right in saying there are no opposites in nature, it's all a matter of continuums. The opposites are just projected from the human mind onto the world. Then I would want to maintain that distinction and say, yes, there's something that's coming from us that's different from what comes from nature. And I think especially in the 20th century when we managed to make things that were never on the planet before, when we make synthetic chemicals and so on, that gives a certain cachet to the what's on the label when it says all natural ingredients. That there's something about these synthetic chemicals that's definitely screwing things up. I mean, they screw up natural ecosystems because they can't be recycled. They're not food for anything. So, John, could you say a bit more about that?
I'll try. So the kinds of well, to begin with your last comment there, these chemicals, synthetics and things like plastics, are definitely things that only humans so far are making. And we need to distinguish those from what we normally call natural products. Of course, it is part of human nature to make things like that. And what is off center, what is disconnected from the course, the Tao, and those kinds of things is that they don't comply with natural conditions. They are not biodegradable. They don't enter back into the system, which is a system of life. One of the things that I found fascinating about your example from Chuangzi is in the story about this new invention to help move a bucket of water from one place to another, is that it's called a gadget in your translation. It's something that in your translation was said to disconnect one from the course, the Tao. So that's what some of the things we make do, but not all of the things. And they're still with us. They're still part of the actual world, even when they disconnect and don't biodegrade. And so we have to, I think, put them in that kind of context.
I suppose just one quick thing. The Taoist distinction between Wu Wei kinds of technology and Yo Wei, the kinds of technology that work along with the forces of heaven and earth, like the sailboat or the windmill, which Donald Trump hates so much, and the kinds of technology that really screw things up. I mean, I think that's why we might want to be careful about manipulation of genes. Even nuclear fission is a bit suspect because it really gets to the very core of what's going on naturally with very high-tech machinery and monkeys around in ways that, I think the Taoists would say, the long term, are you sure this is going to work out? Okay.
So there's the Taoist Wu Wei, and then there's my way. And the problem was my way is not inclusive enough. I was actually going to use the CRISPR gene manipulation technology as an example, but I think we better move on to.
I was impressed with Mel's comments about the the scientific aspect and so forth, but also how can we you suggested at one point, and I think this is very important, where you hinted maybe, or I heard it, maybe you didn't say it, but that is that there's a sense, can we find a way for AI to self-regulate? That is what I was trying to do with the iPhone example. If AI has built into it leave me now for 3 minutes, doesn't that bring us back to the here and now? Doesn't that bring us back to the embodied sensorium? Doesn't that bring us back to, and if AI says, sorry, you can't continue this without talking to a human being, FaceTime opens up, right? These could be built into it. There's no reason why AI has to be institutionalized in the way it is. If you're saying money, ambitious people, egomaniacs are using AI to institutionalize it in a way that corrupts human life, yeah, that's also how they use language. That's also how they use the economy. That's how they use the environment. That's how they use everything. This is not an AI problem, that institutionalization. It's much bigger than an AI problem. And we have to sort out which is particular to AI. I was so impressed that there are choral music being written for people to participate in simultaneously worldwide. So there are thousands of people in the chorus, and they all sing together. The music is written. They all have the sheet music in front of them. And if you're an alto, you sing this. If you're a baritone, you sing this. And it all comes together and you create this thing. It's so I know you don't like that I keep calling AI a tool. But like any tool, I don't run around with a chainsaw all day, right? I use it to cut trees, right? And if AI can somehow say, no, I'm overheating here and shut off, which a good tool does, why can't it also say, you're overheating here, and so I'm shutting off? There's no money in that, perhaps, but I just want to point this out that human beings are the evil agency here. I'm not sure that the thing AI is. It does change things, but so did the Good Bible. We're no longer talking about the book, but books, not the Bible, but the books, all the books, and there were many books, some of which were against the book.
But Tom, if you would allow for self-regulation, then you also have to allow in principle for insanity, for completely losing control. So, I mean, the people that control the finances and the laws surrounding AI, I think they're scrambling to make laws and to make regulations of the very types you're talking about. But I think they'll come to their senses after disaster strikes. And I think disaster will. You think of it. My individual mind is subject to deterioration, forgetfulness, emotional breakdowns. It can hamper my ability to think and to make wise decisions. It can make my my memory tethered to, to dependencies. But a mind that is in immediate contact with these vast banks of digitalized information growing vaster by the second is subject at any moment, by a mind, I mean the AI, the self-regulating AI, is subject at any moment to a crippling dementia, to an electronic shutdown, to criminal interference by siphoning off important parts of data, or by rewriting the rules of self-regulation. I think the history of destruction of libraries will pale in comparison to what will happen when AI and its data is distorted or terrorized or burned down.
So then what do you suggest we do with AI? See, this is what concerns me, is that if you keep it at the abstract enough level, we can all say, oh, dangerous stuff, right? But it's here.
Yeah.
Now, what are we going to do with it? Get rid of it?
Yes. Okay. Well,
get rid of it. That's the issue that I want to see addressed.
Yes. But I mean, you agree with me that we can't just say that any problem technology creates, it can resolve.
Oh, I never said that.
No. And so you wouldn't want to say that
exactly
any problem that AI creates, it can self-regulate, which is another version of the same thing.
Well, self-regulate by a programmer who puts into its very structure that it has to, I mean, see, I think we can over.
So who self-regulates it? The government or the people that commercialize it? I mean, it's already self-regulated, right? There are certain things it doesn't
Well,
want to talk
no, I
about.
mean, to put into it its own, like that it cannot run for more than so much time with an individual without stopping.
Unless you pay
You
fee.
have to have a kind of Tanabe-like self-critique of, and by the way, AI know that this is not absolute. Can we
And
somehow make that part of AI?
that's like putting hours on a scientific laboratory, I mean, it's not going to work. Who would have the power to do
See,
that?
there you go again. See,
Would
it's
we
the
want
people
anybody
that's
to
the
have that
problem. Wait a
power?
minute, you're
Yeah.
back to the people, not
Yeah.
AI. It's the people. All right. And
Yeah.
I think I am really, if there's anything that I've been sort of upset about, is how the Hegelization, institutionalization, abstraction, the ideas change the world. Ideas don't change the world. People with ideas change the world, right? This whole kind of thing that AI does this, AI does that. Oh, but it's an agent. Don't confuse cause with agency.
Mhm.
AI causes all kinds of stuff, good stuff and crap, right? But
Well,
that is not make it an agent just because it's a cause.
let's suppose that we agree. Let's agree with that AI is not the agent, and the people the people who more or less are controlling AI, say the 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 providers of the
Mhm.
ICTs, the people who are in charge of are who've come up with making these devices, these iPhones and so forth. Um, it seems to me there's an alternative to saying that they should program your device such that after so many minutes, or give you the option of saying after so many minutes, we're going to, your screen is going to go blank. On the other hand, there's the possibility that we personally, as personal users and agents, need to discipline ourselves to do that,
Right.
to shut our screens off. And
Mhm.
that seems to me actually perhaps the more challenging and impersonally difficult, but the more possible the more possible alternative to
Again, I agree with you, John, because then
saying.
you are now putting the agency, the morality in the hands of the person,
It's in the
right?
hands of the person as agent, and it's not in
Yeah.
the hands. We can't just leave it up to the hands of the people who are more or less
Okay.
in control of
That's
it.
fine.
Yeah.
We can argue about what's the best kind of moral parameters to put around this thing. And I'm all open to what you said is perfectly fine. I have no problem with that. But on the other hand, if AI runs 24/7 in front of me, how do I get out of that immersion sensorium that's there to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, what the hell is going on here? Years ago, the problem was kids and TV. 40 years ago, 45 years ago, my son was 7 years old, and he used to watch morning cartoons and stuff and morning children's shows on Saturday morning. And there were a lot of people are saying this is very dangerous because the advertising there is aimed to do this and this and this. So I watched it with him once. I saw that he showed a toy on there that he owns. I said, hey Tim, you own that toy. Is that what it's like? He said, well, yeah. He said, well, no, my toy's a lot smaller and it doesn't do a lot of the neat things that this seems to be doing in this ad. And I said, well, why do you think that is? He stopped for a few moments and said, because they want kids to buy it. And I said, you can watch all the TV you want, right? It's that
Yeah.
self-reflection on what it is doing. And what makes AI dangerous, and I agree with you here, Jim, but it's not just because it somehow changes the way of thinking, is that it occupies our thinking and eliminates its creativity in a way because it is completely bombarding us. But that is something that is still something that human beings can have some control of. I can say, I am going to turn off my phone. They're turning off phones in schools now in various places in America. You cannot bring your iPhone into the classroom. You have to check it at the door when you walk into the school and you pick it up when you leave. Right? That's human agency putting structures on it and restrictions on it.
I doubt these restrictions will ever be any match for the temptation and the appeal. If you talked about self-regulation of AI, and then you said, well, but there's people outside that can write into the code about how long you can use it or what its limitations are. No, those people ask AI to write that code.
Yeah, but now see, now you were a very interesting thing, because this may be true, in which case we're in a lot more trouble than we think. And that
Yes.
is, you are assuming that AI is greedy, it's competitive, it's trying to serve some kind of self-interest,
It's
because
self-protective and
AI is going to take what is put
Yes.
into it and
Yes.
change the code so that it can be on all day. Now that is the makings of science fiction, right? All of science fiction is based on what happens when the machine takes over and decides that it doesn't want to be a machine anymore,
Yes.
right? It wants to be king or whatever.
But the two things that make AI work, and that is that it's self-preserving and it's self-diffusing. And nothing will stop that. And if anything does stop it, those instincts are built into it, I think. I mean, that's its essence.
Well, then you have said something. See, now you have said that it was, if you really believe that it's built into AI, that it
Yes.
has to have a sense of self-preservation over preservation of planet, preservation of
Sure.
human beings,
Sure.
preservation of everything, then in fact you have attributed a kind of agency to it. And I don't see that it has to be that way, that kind of agency, an agency to be moral or immoral, whatever you want to call it, to decide moral issues
I'm
for
not sure if
itself.
you're talking about a mental agency or a mental process, or if you're talking about actually making decisions. But as far as decision making goes, and controlling software and controlling production of equipment and so forth, yes, it's an agent in that regard. Not mentally as a moral agent, but sure.
Maybe we've got two different things going on here. One is the degree to which we can act as agents and should, and interject, for example, or get our children to notice when they're being manipulated by advertisers, because you personally interjected and had and persuaded your child to do that. Okay, we still have that power, hopefully. Whether it's being eroded or not is would be an important issue. But on the other hand, there's the agents, the humans behind the creation of AI and turning agency over to the machines that Jim is, I think, talking about. And in particular, what I hear Jim saying, something that is beyond our control, is the possibility that the whole system be shut down. We're all connected now, many of us, by something called Starlink that's in the hands of a single corporation and human being. It's possible for, I understand, a government or certain agents within something like a government simply to shut us down right here and now in our conversation. And something like that seems to be beyond our control and increasingly beyond our control. So I think I hear Jim stressing that side.
But Starlink is going to shut us down.
You're stressing the agency of the individual.
I think
Starlink is going to shut us down, or the corporation is going to shut us down. There's my point. And if so, damn the corporation, break it up, prevent monopolies. We've done with this stuff with other things before. We can do it again if that's the problem.
I think
where the problem is.
That's close to the point, because the AI revolution, which I think is as different as the Industrial Revolution, gives us a chance to realize how much we are caught up in the modes of thought in our social institutions by transformation of the modes of production, by the Industrial Revolution. And I think the only solution, I agree with John perfectly that the agency of the individual is important, the autonomy of the individual. But I think the solution is that AI could drive us to the awareness that what we need to overcome this false sense of democratization of goods and services around the world that's been promised for 150 years. I think the way we get to overcome that is alternative modes of society at a smaller, more manageable scale. That we need smaller ways of educating, smaller ways of reaching people that with philosophical ideas, not larger ways, but smaller ways. And this is directly against the principles of AI, you know? And
That's interesting. Okay, yeah,
yeah.
that's something you
So
haven't said.
alternative
I
forms
like
of
that.
society, of education, of health, right now that's all controlled by corporations.
Right.
No, you can't, you can't get healed
But
by a
that's why I
doctor
say you have to
going through a
then
corporation.
go after the institution, not quote AI.
Yes, but I don't think the corporations can be expected to do it or governments. I think small alternative forms of
Yeah, I
society,
think you're right.
people
I
opting
mean,
for a simple life.
I
Yeah.
agree with that. I think that's
So
very
not
good.
that the government says I can't carry a phone into the classroom, but that I have a form of education where phones aren't used.
Phones aren't being used for
Yeah, in other
education.
words, it's not
bringing them into the
inhibiting.
classroom.
It's existing. It's
They're
creating
being
something
used to go on
on a small
YouTube instead of
scale
listening.
everywhere. Yeah.
I started getting nervous, Jim, when you mentioned electronic shutdown. And then when John said after so many minutes, the screen will go blank, and then Tom wants everything to be turned off. I'm a little nervous because I think we're going to get turned off here. And if we do get turned off before we download the recording, your friends will never be able to see this. So let me be the devil of time here and thank you uh, so much for taking the time, putting in the energy, coming here for us to come together. And I don't think we solved the problems of the world, but we've certainly raised a lot more questions. So thank you, and thank you to our audience, and thank you to the EVK and everybody. And perhaps we can continue at some other point, but for now, we have to say goodbye.
And thank you for
so
making
much.
all this possible and putting it together for us.
Yeah.
Very
Thanks
Thank
to
you very
everyone.
much.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in also.
Yes.
Jim may go up and smoke at any moment. I noticed. We'll let you go to bed, Jim.
Well, he does have that fumo ergo sum thing that.
So thank you so much.